In this session, we'll take a close look at the Senate version of this important bipartisan legislation, and we'll explore why it's critical for the climate, for forest health, and for wildfire resistance. So I mentioned that we had a star-studded affair tonight. First of all, we have Dana Nuccitelli, he's the Citizens Climate Lobby's research manager. He is a well-known climate science communicator, environmental scientist, who translates complex scientific findings into accessible, actionable insights for volunteers and policymakers. He also plays a key role in grounding CCL's policy work and the latest research and evidence, and we are very happy about that. And then also we have Jennifer Tyler tonight. Jennifer is CCL's Vice President of Government Affairs. Many years of experience on Capitol Hill. Jen leads CCL's legislative strategy and engagement with members of Congress. She ensures that our policy work is not only timely, but impactful and aligned with the changing political landscape. Tonight, our 3 learning goals. If we've done a great job tonight, you are going to know all about the Senate version of the Fix Our Forest Act. We had a previous training on the House version, but tonight we'll focus just on the Senate version. We'll explore some of the critiques of the bill and why CCL supports it. And we'll discuss CCL's planned role in supporting the Fix Our Forest Act. So with that, I will hand it off to Jennifer Tyler. Jen, it's all yours.
Thanks, Ricky, and so glad you all are joining us tonight. I'm excited to chat about the bill. There's been some more momentum, and I know we've had a lot of discussions in our different calls, liaison, group leaders, national calls about the bill, and I know there's a lot of questions. So we'll get right into it and hopefully run through a lot of content really quick. We will make sure the slides are available after. You can have the recording after. So if I go fast, I apologize. I just want to make sure I get through everything. And we will hopefully leave as much time as we can for questions at the end. So jumping right into it, why are we supporting this bill? There's 3 primary reasons. And these are some of the reasons we look at with all bills we look to endorse. These are not the only reasons we consider, but for this bill, these are the top 3. 1, it's good for our forests and the climate. And Dana will talk a lot about this, but the data is there. The science is backing up that this bill would be beneficial for the forest and also for the climate. It makes sure that our forests are healthier. They store more carbon, keeping that out of the atmosphere. And that's a win for the climate. Secondly, it's building that bipartisan common ground on issues we care about. In this case, this bill covers 2 different policy areas. It's both a forest health bill in our forestry, healthy forest policy area, and it's also a permitting reform bill. So we're hitting both of those policies in this one bill, and we're building that bipartisan momentum for both of those policy areas, bringing people to the table, and that's helping us set a foundation for bigger and larger policies down the road in both of those spaces, especially in the permitting reform space. And lastly, this needs our help to pass. This is not a surefire thing that would happen either way. When in talking to the offices as they were composing the bill and then introducing it, there was a gap in that grassroots support, and there was a real need to have people in the communities, in districts, learning about the bill, educating themselves, and then ideally supporting the bill and really making their voices heard on Capitol Hill. So we can play a real key role here in moving this policy forward, and that's a key component we look for in any bill that we endorse. Is our voice going to be helpful in this effort? Is it necessary? And in this case, yes, we are needed to help move this bill forward, and we've already seen that play out a bunch. So that's a little bit about why we support this bill. I will turn it over to Dana, who will start getting a little bit more into the science behind it all.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. So let's talk about the problem that Fix Our Forest is trying to help solve. So we're lucky in the United States. We have some really great forests. About 1/3 of our land area is covered by forests, and they pull about 12% of our annual climate pollution out of the atmosphere. The problem is that that is expected to decline over time. On the right here, you can see this nice chart from our friends at RFF, looking at the amount of carbon pulled out of the atmosphere by natural climate solutions in the United States over time. So you can see the blue, the big chunk here is from forests. The red is wood products. The green is agriculture. And this brownish color it's called settlements, but it's basically urban trees. So you can see like the big chunk is from our forests. And that is expected to starting to decline. It's expected to decline more over time for a few reasons. One, because as we all are, our forests are aging and then they're not growing as much and thus not pulling as much carbon out of the atmosphere. They're also stressed by climate change, by extreme heat and drought, and they are burning more because we're getting bigger wildfires. So we want to solve that problem, and we can do that through a couple different things. We can do reforestation, planting more trees. Hopefully, we'll see some legislation along those lines in Congress later this year, maybe next year, we'll see. And through mitigating wildfires, and that is where Fix Our Forest comes in. So wildfires are getting worse, especially in the West, for two big reasons. One, of course, being climate change, making it hotter and drier. The other being forest management. We used to, when there were indigenous populations doing cultural burning, they would kind of keep the forests more under control. And then 150 years ago or so, they were replaced by colonialism and the practice of extreme fire suppression, putting out natural fires as quickly as possible. And as a result, the forest got much, much more dense. And so you can see this nice chart here, looking at some different forested areas in California. The light green are estimated forest density, trees per area. 150 years ago, the dark green is the same area today. And so you can see that today, our forests are on average about 3 times more dense, 3 times more trees per area than they were 150 years ago. So we have this combination of hotter, drier, and denser forests, and that's a bad combination. That's a recipe for megafires. And so what Fix Our Forests is trying to address is the denser part and make them less dense, and thus less prone to megafires. So there are some key concepts when dealing with or trying to understand these fires in forest management and what we're trying to do here. So you can think of the canopy or the crown and the fires reaching up to the top of the trees. Those are the hottest and most destructive wildfires if they're getting that big and that intense. Those are burning canopy fuels, which are branches and leaves up at the top of the trees. There's surface fires, which are burning low along the ground. They tend to be less intense, but they can become crown fires. But those are burning surface fuels like litter, leaves, needles, things like that, cones that are on the ground. So those are low fires, low intensity. But there are ladder fuels that kind of carry the surface fires up into the canopy potentially. And the ladder fuels are things like smaller trees that kind of allow the fires to expand up into the crown of the trees, the canopy of the trees. And so that's kind of what we're trying to prevent from happening through wildfire mitigation measures. So there's this main concept. We're trying to reduce the likelihood that a surface fire will become a crown fire. So there are a few ways to do that. You can do fuel reduction, aka thinning of forests, removing that excess fuel, things like the smaller trees, to keep the forests less dense, less likely for the small fires to become big fires. You can use chipping, which is putting the smaller vegetation through a chipper, which then makes chips along the ground, which will burn the ground, the low intensity low fires, but prevent it from going up into the canopy. It's called understory burn. And you can use prescribed fire, which is when you intentionally ignite a fire under conditions that you can keep it under control. So again, it's burning the more susceptible vegetation, those ladder fuels in a given area, but you keep it under control so it doesn't become a large fire and it's just getting rid of those ladder fuels. So there's been some good research into the effectiveness of these methods. There was a 20-year study that was published. They published their paper on it in 2023. And what they did was they took a different segments of forest. They did like a controlled segment where they didn't touch it. And then they did some other areas where they did prescribed burns, where they did mechanical thinning, and when they did a combination of the two. And they went back 20 years later and looked at the forests, and they basically found that in all of those treated areas, the prescribed burn, the mechanical thinning, and both in all of those, the forest conditions after 20 years were much more resistant to wildfire than the control area. So the lead author said that forest thinning can be viable way to mitigate fire risk as long as it's done sustainably, and that we're strategic about what trees we're chopping down. So we're not chopping down the big trees that are more resilient against fires. We're chopping down the little ones that become ladder fuels. So the good news is the Forest Service knows how to do that. They've got the expertise, and all the research I'm talking about here, the Forest Service was involved. In this one, there was a 2020 study that the Forest Service was pretty much the main group doing the research. What they did in this one was in 2011, they, again, similar, took a bunch of different plots where they did thinning in kind of different ways. They did what's called low variability thinning, which is when they kind of keep a steady distance between the trees that are left over when they're thinning it out. So it's kind of a steady, evenly spaced leftover trees. And then they did high variability thinning, which is, you can see in the top right here, it's kind of bigger spaces. It's less regular in the spacing between the remaining trees. And then they did just control where they didn't touch it. And they also did some prescribed burns in this area. So they did that in 2011. And it just so happens that, and this was in California, and it just so happens that in 2012 to 2016 was kind of California's most intense period of drought. So it went to extreme drought conditions right after they did this experimental design. And they went back several years later and they looked at it and they found that all the thinned forests, the areas that they did this mechanical thinning, was more resilient to that drought. The trees survived more. And you can see that in this chart here. We're looking at the change in tree density after the treatment and after the extreme drought happened. And so you can see in the control area, lots of trees died. In the areas that were thinned and or burned, there was a lot more tree survival because there were fewer trees left there competing for the reduced water and nutrients that were available. And so they were able to survive the drought better than this dense forest where there was a lot of trees competing. So they basically found that the thinning and the controlled burns worked well at making the forest more resilient to this drought. They also found that if you do this variable thinning and then you do a controlled burn, it creates conditions in the forest that are more similar to historical conditions, like 150 years ago, when the forests were resilient to wildfires. So it's good for droughts, good for wildfires. There was also a study just published last month that found thinner forests could mitigate drought in general, because when you have a very dense forest, you have a lot of tree canopy, and then if rain falls, a lot of the water is kind of captured in the tree canopy above the ground, and then it evaporates back into the atmosphere and never reaches the ground. Whereas if you have a thinner forest, then more water reaches the ground to be absorbed by the trees and to run off to the rest of the state. And so they found that forest thinning helps resilience against drought for both the forest and actually the entire state of California as a whole. So we're going to show a couple examples here. This is a brief video of the Forest Service talking about one case where they did some of this wildfire management.
Within the Big Pines Highway project, we had some high value areas. One of them was the NASA JPL facility. They have a lot of expensive telescopes that they do a lot of research with. When we came through just beneath their property, it was very dense with oaks and brush and shrubs. And so what we did is we thinned the oaks out, we cut the brush, and we chipped everything. Later on, we came through and we did prescribed fire. When the fire came through, the fire basically went around the entire burned area and avoided everything that we had done within the fuels treatment. The areas where we don't do fuels treatments, you can see a complete difference. Whereas the areas where we do fuels treatment, the effect of the fire is very minimal. We want it to come through here, especially with all this timber, as a nice understory burn. And that's basically burning all the chips on the ground, low intensity, and going through. So as you can see, the trees still have green in them in this area, and the ground is pretty much black. But the great thing is this area gets a lot of moisture. So when we come back in, let's say next spring, you won't even be able to tell there was a fire here.
Yeah, and then one more really good example is in South Lake Tahoe. And so one critique of the Fix Our Forests Act is people don't like the expansion of what's called categorical exclusions in NEPA, expanding them from 3,000 acres to 10,000 acres. But there is one area that in laws passed over the past decade has had that 10,000 acre categorical exclusion for wildfire management, and that's in the South Lake Tahoe area. So in this map, you can see the yellow are areas that received some kind of wildfire mitigation, whether it be thinning and or prescribed burns. And then you can see in 2021, there was this really big fire, the Caldor fire. In this red here, you can see kind of it was approaching South Lake Tahoe right here. And it basically stopped and was, it didn't reach the city because it ran up against these areas being that were successfully treated through mechanical thinning and burning. And essentially, you can argue that this categorical exclusion and these wildfire treatments help preserve the city of South Lake Tahoe. So that's a good example of what we're talking about in the bill working in practice. So now I'm going to pass it back to Jen to talk about what's in the bill specifically.
All right, great. Well, I think Dana did a great job of kind of setting the stage for us of why this bill is necessary, is specifically what the bill does. So top line, I talked about this before, it's this bridge, it's this connection between permitting reform and healthy forests. So it focuses on these reforms to the permitting process, in this case, permitting or, approval of wildfire mitigation projects and techniques, and as well as this technology, different sorts of innovation advancements to make our forests healthier overall. So it's those two components that this bill kind of merges together. And a big focus in this bill is the fact that it is removing those bureaucratic roadblocks that slow down some of these forest restoration projects, and make sure that we're able to do those projects in a more timely, efficient manner to respond to this growing crisis, not just the climate crisis, but in this case, the wildfire crisis. So I want to be very clear, because I know this the question I think has already popped in the Q&A, what this bill does not do. There is this concern, I'm sure we all are hearing a lot about DOGE and all the cuts at the agencies. This bill does not address the Forest Service workforce. It does not address the funding and the resources of the Forest Service. And that's by design. The people who created this bill, the legislators who created this bill, wanted to make it as strategic and as possibly successful as it could be. They knew that coupling it with that funding or with requirements for staff would make it basically dead on arrival. And so they carefully constructed this bill to focus just on the policy. That being said, we know that there is a need for staffing. There's a need to protect what's left at the Forest Service. There's a need to increase that. And there's also a need for funding at the Forest Service beyond staff. And so we are working with the sponsors of this legislation to push them and other members who are on different committees to push them to advocate for that, for both staffing as well as for just straight funding for the Forest Service and other relevant agencies. And there is action happening on that front. We are going through the appropriations process. Those requests are starting to be drafted. So we will have updates for you on that front. But I just want to make it clear this bill does not include that, but it doesn't mean we are not heavily focused on that. And we know that those two components, they need to move simultaneously on parallel tracks. They're not moving together, but they both need to move. Now, specifically what's in the bill. There's a lot here. There's a few slides of major provisions. I'm going to pick out the ones that I think are the most relevant, but you can always review these after the fact. So fireshed management areas. It creates this new nationwide system that's going to designate the top 20% of wildfire exposed landscapes for these different kind of wildfire mitigation projects and plans. So it's going to make sure that we're identifying where are the landscapes that are most susceptible to these wildfires, putting not only the resources behind it, but also the processes in place so that we're analyzing the data, we're reviewing them, and we're creating some sort of action plan going forward to protect the communities, protect the forests. Fireshed assessments. So this is a second part of that management area. For the different firesheds that are identified through that, there are these assessments that are done. And this is very science-based, very detailed wildfire risk analyses for each of these individual areas. And it's going through what is the risk posed to the forest, but also surrounding areas and especially community if it does run up along an urban community. And then what are the different sort of restoration strategies that are going to benefit this specific place? As Dana mentioned, there's a lot of different types of fires and pathways that a wildfire can happen. And there's also different mitigation techniques. Some are better in some areas than others. So these assessments are going to help identify what's the best thing for each area. And these assessments are done in collaboration with local government officials, local communities, local towns, mayors, all of that, as well as tribal collaboration. So there's a lot of earlier engagement with local governments and tribal governments in this bill than there is currently in the typical consultation process. A fireshed registry, so it creates this sort of public-facing database where we're showing the science and the data that they are able to identify of where is the fire risk, where is the fire if there's ongoing fires, where are the different treatments that have been done, that are completed, what was the effect of those treatments. All of that data right now is pretty siloed, not very publicly accessible. This would put it all in one place so that everyone's on the same page. States can take action based on the data that's on the ground. And that Wildfire Intelligence Center, very similar, creating that federal coordination hub to put everything together in one place so that we're able to really see all that data together. All right, the Emergency Management Authority will get a lot more into this, but this is that expanded use of categorical exclusions that Dana mentioned, where we're expanding categorical exclusions from 3,000 acres to 10,000. There's different requirements in there. It's not just a blanket approval for any sort of project. We'll talk a lot more about that later on. Litigation and consultation reforms. So there are different provisions. This is another contentious part of the bill that limits certain lawsuits against forest health projects, and it also changes the way the Forest Service has to do different consultations. So it doesn't remove any ability to sue, it doesn't remove any requirement to consult, but it makes strategic reforms to make those processes not as lengthy and to not slow down so many of these projects for years and years and years. All right, and reforestation and nursery investment. I'm highlighting this one because we've worked on it. We worked on the Seedlings for Sustainable Habitat Act. We worked on IIJA, the infrastructure bill that included some funding for nurseries. And so this is a big priority. As we're dealing with this forest health, we also have to deal with kind of the first step in the process, which is, do we have the nurseries in place? Do we have the capacity for growing and planting new trees to restore these areas or make them healthier as we do all of this wildfire mitigation? A white oak restoration initiative. This was a new change. It's a national program that would really restore some of these hardwood ecosystems. There's a focus on white oaks, but this is really, a kind of not handout, but Senator Mitch McConnell is it favors his bourbon given the state he represents, and so white oaks are pretty critical to the bourbon making process. So there's different pieces here and there that we'll see that appeal to some member over another. That's one of the weird little niche ones, but nonetheless, hardwood ecosystems are definitely being hit hard, and it's an important provision. And then biochar. I know Dana has talked a lot about this in some previous trainings, but there's a section that makes sure that we're investing more in biochar in different demonstration projects, grants, policy development, so that we're really getting further ahead on that. Changes from the Senate. So the House introduced their bill, they moved their legislation through committee and then across the House floor. The Senate then introduced their bill and they made a few changes. They made sure that there's these joint Departments of Interior and Agricultural Wildfire Intelligence Center. That's what I talked about, where we're kind of sharing the data, getting everyone in the federal government on the same page. Make sure that wildfire recovery is eligible for Joint Chiefs Landscape Restoration Partnership Program. It expands programs to protect and restore watersheds, including wildfire management. And then that lawsuit, that litigation provision, which was limiting the statute of limitations, the amount of time someone has to file a lawsuit against a forest project. The House version had a limit of 120 days for someone to file that lawsuit. The Senate version increased that to 150 days. And there's a few other changes here, but I'll kind of skip through those for the sake of time so we can get to questions. You guys can look at those after. The status of the bill. Well, as I mentioned, so the House moved their bill forward. They introduced their bill, moved it through committee, and passed it on the House floor. It passed by a vote of 279 to 141. I point this out to highlight that, yes, this is a contentious bill. Yes, it was certainly not unanimous by any means. It doesn't have complete Democratic support, but it does have really significant Democratic support. And there were 9 more Democratic yay votes this Congress than a previous Congress, showing that there is growing momentum and understanding amongst the Democratic caucuses in both the House and the Senate that this is necessary. We need to do this. We highlighted here the California Democrats, obviously a state that's been hit hardest, one could arguably say, from these recent wildfires. And 24 yes votes compared to 15 no votes. So there's definitely still some tension there. There's not unanimity, but there's a lot of Democrats who are realizing this is an urgent crisis that we have to respond to, and it's not necessarily going to be the easiest thing to vote for, but they know how important it is. That Senate version was introduced in early April. It's led by Senators Padilla, Curtis, Hickenlooper, and Sheehy. You'll notice all of those states really susceptible to wildfire. So this is being led by some of our favorite, I would say, members who have worked on our causes in the past, who we really view as champions, but also members who just they hear about this at home. Their constituents are being impacted by this, and that's why they're taking a lead on it. There was a recent legislative hearing on the bill this past Tuesday in the Senate Agriculture Committee, and the Forest Service testified and said a lot of great things about the bill and what they think the bill would allow them to do. They reinforced a lot of the points we're going to make in this presentation about the fact that this legislation, while it does streamline a lot of these processes, these permitting processes, the categorical exclusions, and deals with the litigation provisions, there are still really strict protections in the legislation and in the law to make sure that these policies, these different streamlinings are going to be used in a way to protect the forest, not in any other way. So they went over that many times, which was reassuring, I think, for a lot of people to hear that directly from the Forest Service mouth, that they're going to use this bill as it is written, as it is intended, including the protections that are within the legislation and in existing statute to keep it directly for forest health and preservation. Supporting organizations. There's a bunch here. As you look through, there might be some that are more relevant to your member, more relevant to your state, but I bolded the ones that I think are going to kind of pop out at you as organizations we partner with a lot or that are really relevant in our circles. The Nature Conservancy, National Wildlife Federation, Environmental Defense Fund, or EDF, the National Audubon Society, and American Forests, who we had recently on a national call. Those are all organizations that are supporting this Senate bill. Jumping into opposing arguments. So the first one, probably the one we hear the most, is that Fix Our Forest is going to open up millions of acres of forest to clear cutting. Well, this bill does expand existing categorical exclusions for emergency fireshed management projects. We've talked about this. So it's expanding these categorical exclusions from 3,000 to 10,000 acres per project. But all of those projects, no matter what the size is, it has to still meet these different criteria that are listed here. So it's got to maximize retention of old growth in large trees. It has to consider the best available scientific information to maintain or restore ecological integrity, and it has to develop and implement plans through a collaborative process. So there is no categorical exclusion. There's no wildfire resilience project that's going to take place because of this legislation that would not do those three things. It has to meet those criteria. And we heard the Forest Service themselves say that in the hearing this week, that these are the protections and they will stick by those. Now, there is one exception I want to highlight. There is an exception for fuel breaks, and that was included in the bipartisan infrastructure bill a few years ago now, maybe more than that. But those fuel breaks can be no more than 1,000 feet wide, and they must be contiguous with or incorporate existing infrastructure like roads and transmission lines. So that's the one little carve out there where it doesn't have to meet those three criteria. But again, it's a pretty narrow carve out. It's 1,000 feet wide. It has to, impact things like roads or transmission lines. So we don't expect that exception to be, run with wild. It's there for a reason largely because of these transmission lines and how much fuel there is on the ground there that can cause some pretty devastating fires. A little bit more on categorical exclusions. Right now, I want to highlight that right now, there's already categorical exclusions for 3,000 acres. So it's not that categorical exclusions are not happening at all for these sort of forest projects, these wildfire mitigation projects. They're already happening, but they're limited to 3,000 acres. So what's happening is when they have a larger area, they're filing for multiple categorical exclusions, which is slowing things down. This is expanding that from 3,000 to 10,000 so they can do one categorical exclusion. It's not that without this bill, they don't get a categorical exclusion. They still would. It would just take longer. They'd have to do more of them and cobble them all together. Now, Any project that receives a 10,000 acre categorical exclusion under this bill has to be identified by a fireshed assessment. And that's what we talked about before, where they identify the fireshed, they do these deep assessments that goes through all the science and data, and it has to have that community input. It has to have the local participation to make sure that it's encapsulating both the science, the data, what's actually helpful to this forest, and also the local input of what's helpful or beneficial on the ground to the people in that area. And I listed here the land management goals. So there's another part of this legislation that refers to the Healthy Forest Restoration Act. And it says that any project that qualifies for categorical exclusion has to meet at least one of the following of these land management goals. So not only does it have to meet those 3 requirements I previously listed about protecting old growth forests on the previous slide, and considering the best available scientific information and being completed in a collaborative process, but it also has to complete one of these land management goals. And as you kind of read through them, they're all pretty great goals. And none of them are logging, none of them are clear cutting forests or anything like that. These are all really specific, a lot of them just to ecological purposes, restoration and health. All right. So last thing on categorical exclusions, and then we'll jump off to something else. Why are they so important? Well, they really can reduce wildfire mitigation project timelines significantly. If you can see here in this little diagram, you'll kind of look at the different times it takes. The top is mechanical treatments, the bottom is prescribed burns, but you can see how much shorter the timeline is for these categorical exclusions compared to if they have to do a full assessment or full environmental review. The Forest Service estimates that 80 million acres need fuel treatment, and right now we're dealing with less than 2 million per year. So to get to that 80 million, we're looking at a really long time if we keep going on the timelines we have now. So these categorical exclusions, which again are already in place for up to 3,000 acres, expanding that to 10,000 acres is just going to help shorten that timeline further, so we're able to do more of these projects more quickly and address that backlog of the 80 million acres plus that really need this treatment to prevent the wildfires. The second biggest opposing argument that Fix Our Forest is going to prevent the protection of endangered species. This has to do with this provision called the Cottonwood Fix. This is getting really in the weeds, so if you're not particularly interested, you can plug your ears and not listen to this one. But there is a fix called the Cottonwood Fix that prevents redundant agency consultations and prevents delays. There was a Cottonwood ruling that said that if there was a new critical habitat designated for an endangered species, then the Forest Service had to reinitiate consultation with wildlife agencies on their entire forest plan. So that was even if no actual project was underway. If there was any additional endangered species identified in an area, the Forest Service had to start all the way over consulting with wildlife agencies on the entire forest plan. Well, that made the Forest Service, if there was a project going on, they had to pause all projects across a national forest. The pauses could last a couple months, it could last years and years, depending how long these consultations would take and how clear the endangered species information was. Even if the projects were not in the area of the endangered species or didn't impact the endangered species habitats, it still would pause the projects. And this was such a problem that even the Obama administration argued against this policy, stating that it would cripple the Forest Service and cripple what they're trying to do. So what this fix in the bill does is it reverts things back. It says that the Forest Service does not have to redo consultation for the whole forest plan every time a critical habitat is updated. They just have to make sure that consultation is happening at the project level. So if there's a project that's happening and an endangered species is identified in that project area, yes, they have to pause it and do consultation. But if we're talking about a national forest and there's a endangered species that comes up in one area and there's a separate project happening in a completely different area that's unaffected, they don't have to pause all projects across the whole national forest. They have to address that critical habitat that was identified while they can continue these other projects that are not impacting that. Last one, and I think we've mentioned this before, the Fix Our Forest Act will enable the administration's executive order on timber production to allow forest clear cutting. So there was an executive order that directed a few agency heads to find ways to produce more timber on different federal lands, But this bill, as I mentioned, has really stringent criteria for what sort of projects can qualify for fireshed management for all of these wildfire mitigation projects. Ecological forestry, which is ecological thinning and controlled burns, as Dana walked us through, is really different from clear cutting, not the same thing at all. And dealing with that litigation provision I mentioned, there's a claim that the Fix Our Forests Act would prevent citizens from holding federal agencies accountable. Well, even though the Fix Our Forests Act does limit the time period to file a lawsuit, it doesn't prevent lawsuits. It doesn't prevent citizens from holding federal agencies accountable. Individuals can still file lawsuits and challenge forest plans that they think are not right for the forest or not right for the community, but they have 150 days to do that. That's approximately 5 months to do that for any legal challenge filings. And when they do that, the typical process would happen. It doesn't change the litigation process. It just changes the window by which you have to file a certain suit. And that puts it on the same standard as a lot of different surface transportation projects, energy projects, aviation projects. It was the same proposal that was in the Energy Permitting Reform Act that we worked on last Congress. So this 150 days is becoming more standard within the federal government in terms of this litigation timeline. And that's because it can take so long, it can delay projects so long if you leave that window open. And I like Dana put this in here for perspective. Today, we're only 109 days into the second Trump term. So that's just a little perspective. 150 days is how long you have to file these suits. So it's not a short period of time. A couple more things on the litigation reform. Over the past decade, 80% of the projects challenged under the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, were won on appeal by the Forest Service, and they were moved forward without any changes. So we're not talking about a lot of projects that are being challenged and rolled back. Most of the challenges are falling, and the Forest Service is prevailing. The lawsuits delayed projects on average of nearly 4 years. So a pretty long time for these lawsuits that are not moving forward. Lastly, before we jump into questions, next steps. Well, as I mentioned, there was a legislative hearing this Tuesday. The Forest Service Acting Associate Chief, Chris French, testified. It's a really good watch. I think we'll put the links somewhere in this presentation so you can have it. It's a great hearing if you'd like to listen and learn more about the bill. We are expecting, after this legislative hearing, with the positive support it got from committee, we are expecting the bill to be marked up in the coming weeks in the Senate Agriculture Committee. And so we are going to start with a small mobilization targeting only Senate Agriculture Committee members. That'll be both Republicans and Democrats, but you all will be hearing about that in the next week or so. And with that, I think we are ready for question and answer.
Yeah, wow. Thank you so much. A lot of information there, and give you guys just a chance to take your breath. If you have a question for Dana and Jen, and we were also joined, I think I saw Danny Richter also joined us as well. Danny is here to help answer questions too. Please drop those in the Q&A feature. If you don't see the Q&A feature at the very bottom of your screen, you should see a little circle with 3 dots that says more. Click on that. It's probably hiding up underneath that. First question, and maybe this is kind of taking a step back. For those who aren't totally familiar with the term categorical exclusion and what it means, maybe just lead off there and just Dana or Jen, can you address what that means and why it's important with this bill?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in first, and then Dana, if you've got anything to add. So a categorical exclusion, or CX or CE, sometimes you'll see them referred to, is a category of actions that a federal agency has determined after reviewing it does not normally have a significant impact on the human environment. So if a project has really large, clear consequences, then it typically goes through an environmental assessment, or an EA, or an environmental impact statement, or an EIS. Those are much more lengthy processes under NEPA, under the National Environmental Policy Act, that are much more time intensive and go through a lot more paperwork to determine what is the different impact on the human environment, how significant, what are the different implications of it. If it qualifies for a categorical exclusion, that means that the agency has determined after reviewing it that it does not have a significant impact on the environment, and therefore it does not need to go through that environmental assessment or environmental impact statement. So it's a more streamlined process. Now, categorical exclusions are a form of compliance with NEPA. I want to be clear that they're not separate from NEPA. categorical exclusions are within the National Environmental Policy Act. So this is a provision of NEPA that was created for a reason, for projects we don't think are going to significantly impact the environment, and they're there for a reason. Now we want to make sure they're used correctly, and that's why it's important this bill has those specific stringent criteria for what would qualify as a categorical exclusion. But nonetheless, this is a part of NEPA. This is a thing that's been used many years in a lot of different projects. Categorical exclusions have to streamline different projects going forward. But yeah, anything to add to that, Dana or Danny?
I think you covered it pretty well.
Did
Thumbs
great.
up. All right.
Nailed it. All right. There's a question, a sort of general question about, I guess, the dangers of taking action and passing this bill and possibly having people take advantage of it. I think you alluded to it, Jen, towards the end of your presentation, but also on the other side of that, not taking action. What's the danger, to the climate and the forest? So sort of, how do we, as CCL, and, when you're looking at those two possibilities, how do you balance that when you're considering the legislation?
Yeah, I definitely think it's a bigger concern these days, I think, than we've had in the past because of some of the, unprecedented actions that have happened. And certainly I think the staffing is one of those concerns, is we need to make sure there's an adequate staff in the Forest Service to implement this bill and make sure it's implemented correctly. That being said, any piece of legislation, an existing statute, can be used in a way that's not legal or not based on the intended, the way it was written. And that's why we have a judicial system and the court system there to hold agencies accountable and to make sure that they're corrected if they take those steps away from what a statute intends. So it could happen no matter what. Could this policy go into place and all of a sudden we see something, an agency act on it in a way that's completely illegal? Certainly. And then we would expect it would be challenged in court the way many other agency actions that have been illegal have been thus far, and then put on hold and subsequently rolled back. So I can't say there's no risk of that, but I don't think there's any greater risk with this policy than with any other policy these days. And we're very conscientious of that. And that's in part why we are also pushing for the staffing and the resources. And to your last point, Ricky, I do think, there is certainly a risk, and I think Senator Padilla is the one who keeps saying this in the press, that there's definitely a risk and a concern of not having adequate staffing or resources to implement this, but there's a greater risk of inaction and what that will mean to our forests and to our communities. And so we can't wait for a different administration. We can't wait for a different environment to address this, where we feel that a policy will be better implemented or we'll feel more trusting of an administration. We have to address it now because that's how critical this is. That's how many lives are at stake, and that's how much of our environment is at risk from these wildfires.
Yeah, and that's the way I view that. This is that the status quo, we reached a point where it just is not okay. Like, I'm in California and living through the wildfires in 2020 and 2021, and just the skies being filled with smoke the entire summer. It was just a nightmare. And like the forests are at a point, as I mentioned, they're too dense, they're too hot, and they're too dry. And we're trying to address the hotness and the dryness through climate change legislation, and this is the way we're going to address the density problem. And just leaving it and being like, well, at some point we'll find some better legislation, like 4 years from now or whatever it is. In the meantime, you've got tens of millions of acres burning in the West every year. And so, like, we've just reached a point where we need to speed things up and address this problem. And it's kind of the same way I view permitting reform, where, like, we're trying to make this transition to a clean energy economy. We're not doing it fast enough, and the status quo is just, we've reached a point where the status quo is not good enough, and we need to start taking actions to do better than the status quo.
Right. Thank you too. Maybe along that same vein, a question about, as a climate organization, how can we be sure, I guess 100% sure we're actually making a meaningful and positive difference to the climate with this bill? What guarantees do we have in place, or, do we not have in place and we just have a good feeling about it?
Yeah, I mean, as Jen said, there's never guarantees, because, administrations can break laws, and there's not a whole lot we can do about that. But what we can do is pass good laws that, if you follow this law, then good things will happen. If you follow the requirements in this bill that you're going to do a wildfire mitigation, a fireshed mitigation project in an area you have defined as being of high wildfire risk, and you do it in a way that maintains the large older trees as best as possible, and you're just reducing the ladder fuels as best as possible, and you follow what the bill says, it's going to result in forests that are more resilient against wildfires. And that's what we do, is try to pass legislation that's going to make things better.
Can I jump in here?
Yeah.
Yeah, certainty is for scientists. And so when I was getting my PhD, there was a much higher standard for certainty, and politics is not about certainty. And so CCL has to make decisions based on the best information available. And the political field in which this organization plays is a messy field. And so you're not going to have 100% certainty, but you want, which we think this bill has, you want to be pretty sure that it's going to make things better. And if it's doesn't, you want to have mechanisms to fix that. And so that's what Jen and Dana have referred to with the courts. So there's just the reality of politics in this country and in every country is you're not going to have 100% certainty.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Citizens Climate Lobby's training program. You can tune into more episodes anywhere podcasts are available. Inspired by what you heard today? Join Citizens Climate Lobby to advocate for bipartisan climate solutions. Go to community.citizensclimate.org to find more trainings, resources, your local chapter, national action teams, discussion forums, and more. Be sure to like our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and Instagram @CitizensClimate. We also invite all of our listeners to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more inspiration.
Like what you hear? Recommend us to your friends and make sure to give us a 5-star rating. It helps us show up on other listeners' feeds. Feel free to pass on any suggestions for future episodes in the comments as well.
And together, we are creating the political will for a livable world.